Thank you very much all for coming to this session. The RCT Monster, How to Train Your Dragon. I'm thinking it must be our exciting title that's caused so many people to come along, but we're delighted to have you, and the fact that it's been so popular we had to have bouncers on the door checking your IDs as you came in is pretty impressive. So this is obviously a session about RCTs and about how they work in practice. RCTs have been something that have been really part of the DNA of BIT since it was founded. I think we've now conducted over 500 RCTs of behavioural interventions, so it's a really impressive kind of body of work. We even have a standard slide that we have in most of our slide packs that illustrates our classic RCT. Obviously, there are complications. I think we have quite a technical audience. But just so we're on the same page, an RCT is a form of evaluation where you randomize people into a control and intervention, and this means you have the best possible way of comparing what happens to an intervention, because your intervention group is as good as it could be, the same as your control group on observed and unobservables, as they say. So just to make sure we're all on the same page. The structure of this section is that we'll have a short presentation from each of our fantastic speakers, who I'll introduce in a second, and then we'll have questions afterwards that can be directed to all the speakers. So as with the other sessions, we're using Slido for our questions. So you should all be able to log in to Slido. You can log in either on the Slido app directly or via the Behavioural Exchange website, which can take you to the app, and that's the Slido code if you need it. If you go through the Behavioural Exchange app, you should just be able to go straight into it. So if you ask questions as people, or put in questions as people are, our speakers are speaking, when we come to the point at which we have the question sessions, they'll be there ready. And the other function is that you can, it's all very techy, you can upvote questions, and they'll come to the top of the pile, and we're going to ask from the top downwards. So if you want a question to be asked, then upvote it as much as possible, and we'll get to that more quickly. We did promise the session would be interactive, so slightly daringly, we're going to start with a poll. So if you want to go to Slido now, you should find this question and these answers. So the question, or the statement is, RCTs are the gold standard for evaluating behavioural interventions. So if you all vote now, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and then we're going to show the results live. If only you could do this on election night. Okay, let's see the results. Agree, okay. Interesting, that tells an interesting story. Perhaps maybe as everyone comes to the RCT sessions, it's not entirely surprised that people are positive about RCTs. I think we're all generally positive about RCTs as well, although the session's about how does that then work in reality when you get the chance to do it. We're also aiming to rerun this poll at the end of the session, and if we get our tech sorted, we should be able to show the before and after results, which will be quite interesting. So I'm just going to introduce our speakers. We've got some really fantastic speakers. Along with Behavioural Insights team, there are other sort of large movements that have been supporting empiricism, robust evaluation, and RCTs, particularly the kind of What Works Centre and movement. And one of the kind of biggest advocates and successes in that movement is the Education Endowment Foundation, who've run, I think, over 200 RCTs in schools since they were started up, which is, a really extraordinary achievement given how difficult they are, how challenging they are to run. So I'm delighted that we've got Millie Nevill here to talk to us about that and reflect on that experience and what the foundation has learnt in doing that in really quite a unique way in the UK. Millie will be followed by Kirby Swales, who is has a very impressive title, Director, Local Government Policy and Troubled Families from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Kirby has a really long history and understanding of research generally and evaluation. And really it's a sort of contrast. So we're all keen on RCTs, but they can't be run in every circumstance. And he's going to talk about some really impressive work that his team has done in look at the impact of the Troubled Families programme and how a non-RCT method was able to come up with impact assessment, but also then reflect on whether how that compared to using an RCT. We've already heard quite a bit about technology in the conference, and one of the things that technology is enabling is to run online experiments in a sort of online lab environment. And I'm delighted that we've got Janna Ter Meer, who is the head of Predictive at BIT, and Predictive is a really innovative online RCT lab, which is very has brought a new dimension to running RCTs, an alternative to field RCTs. And she'll be talking about how that compares and the advantages and disadvantages. And then we'll finish with Alex Sutherland, who is our BIT's chief scientist and who has many years' experience in evaluating a whole range of different programs, including behaviourally focused programs, and having employed both RCT and non-RCT quasi-experimental methods, and will giving us an overview of how things have changed and how things look and whether they are the gold standard or not. I think we're ready to get going, so if you could join me in welcoming Millie to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. Right, so who am I? Sadly, I'm not the mother of dragons, though sometimes it feels like it. I have led the evaluation work of the Education Endowment Foundation, the Government What Works Centre for Education, since it was set up in 2011. And during that time, we've spent 110 million on evaluations of teaching and learning programmes, including 150, not over 200, I'm afraid. It's actually 150 RCTs of teaching and learning programmes involving more than half the schools in England. And during this presentation, I'm going to talk about three good things I've learnt during that time, 3 not so good things, and also 3 possible solutions. So first of all, I probably shouldn't admit this, but when I started at the EEF 8 years ago, I'd only ever attempted 1 RCT, and it was pretty rubbish. And at the beginning, we had this rather naive idea that we would only commission gold standard RCTs, whatever that means. And that there'd be lots of people out there who would know exactly how to do this, no problem. But how naive, how untrue that was. And in fact, the last 8 years have been a huge learning curve for me in designing and delivering RCTs in schools, and I'm still learning. Just because something is an RCT doesn't mean it's gold standard. There is a huge continuum from the truly outstanding to the utter rubbish. But what I have learned is that when done well, RCTs provide the optimal and least biased approach for estimating on average whether something works. And secondly, when combined with really good data on cost and implementation, these can provide incredibly powerful information for decision makers on what to spend their budgets. And another thing that a big lesson that I've learned is that people are willing to be randomised. At EEF, we have successfully recruited and randomised more than half the schools in England and over 1 million pupils, and we never would have predicted that 8 years ago. So, now on to some not so good things. We've got Grumpy Dragon. Firstly, and this is a big one, RCTs are not suited to answering some kinds of questions. It's true, there are some things that people are not willing to be randomised to. And we have a list of failed RCTs that we have attempted at EEF, some of which Alex has been involved in. For example, mixed ability grouping versus setting and streaming in school, too ideological. Financial incentives for teachers, too controversial. Changing the school start time to later in the day to accommodate sleepy teenagers, too impractical. For these kinds of questions, we need alternative designs. And secondly, and this is also a big one, sometimes the answer depends. RCTs are great for telling us on average whether something works, but how is an individual school supposed to know whether or not that answer is applicable to them? And I've learned that we need hundreds of schools to tell us what works on average, so imagine how many we need in order to be able to tell what works for different kinds of schools and pupils. And this is a third difficult thing, timing. So I wasn't sure whether to include this because I think to some extent this applies to all kinds of high quality research. But decision makers want answers now, and RCTs take time to plan and deliver well. And please, and also, communication is key. Without excellent communication, they just don't work. And please note, I have not included cost here, and that is because RCTs don't cost money, data collection does. Right, now my final slide, which doesn't seem to want to work. Oh, there we go, hang on. Okay, so three possible solutions. So firstly, at the EEF, we don't just use RCTs, we use many alternative designs. For example, we used mixed method pilots at an early stage in development, and we're also currently using matched comparisons to look at things like mixed ability grouping, but there is a conundrum here, and that is that the very thing that makes it difficult to RCT, something like mixed ability grouping, the fact that it's an unusual or even radical choice, can also mean that it's difficult to create a matched, unbiased comparison as well. Secondly, I think that data archiving and linkage holds huge potential for understanding variation in outcomes for different kinds of users, in our case, pupils and schools. At the EEF, we have every trial that we've ever commissioned is archived, and that data is linked to longitudinal data in the National Pupil Database. Our archive currently contains hundreds of RCTs linked to this data. It is available for research use, and analysis is ongoing at the moment, looking at specific participant groups, including, for example, children in care, those with English as an additional language, those eligible for free school meals, to name a few. And finally, also another on that point is that I'm no expert, but I do understand that machine learning holds some potential for understanding individual treatment effects. And finally, I don't have an answer to the timing problem, except to say we really need to persuade decision makers of the benefits of RCTs. And I think it's also our responsibility to make sure the RCTs that we're designing now are going to be relevant when the results come out. So finally, the title of this session is How to Train Your Dragon. I don't think I've necessarily learnt to train the dragon in the last 8 years or even tame it, but I have got to know RCTs a bit better and learnt to give them the due attention and respect that they deserve. Thank you.
Good afternoon, really pleased to be here. Camilla mentioned their match comparison design, and I'm going to talk about that. So I'm the Director of Local Government Policy, so I'm a policy official in government, but I'm sponsor evaluation of a national programme called Troubled Families, and I'm going to reflect on why we chose it and the potential for whether an RCT would have applied. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit more about the programme so you understand the context and try and get a flavour of a finding for you. So I hope we can fit that in. I'm afraid I haven't got any dragon analogies, unless I think one up on the way through. So the Troubled Families programme is a large social policy intervention which aims to sort of turn around or help the lives of families with complex problems. It's cost about £1 billion over the last spending review period. And fundamentally what we're trying to do is improve services for vulnerable families. In terms of delivery, I'm not going to go through the detail on the slide, but in terms of delivery, what that means is a new approach, which is all about joining up across services rather than people having a sort of reactive experience, but also what we call a challenge and support model. So we sponsor key workers that work with families and effectively coach them and try and help them solve their own problems, which is a kind of different approach to public service delivery. And in doing this, we're trying to take pressure away from some of the statutory social services, but also actually improve outcomes for families. So it's a very worthwhile programme, and we invested heavily in an evaluation. The evaluation uses a range of traditional methods which are on the screen, but I'd draw your attention to the top one. So what we've done is create a large linked administrative database of over 300,000 families and 1 million individuals. That's both children and adults in those families, and we track them across a number of government databases, including the National Pupil Database, also the National Social Care Database, the National Crime Database, and the National Benefits and Employment Databases. So what we've done is create this large administrative tool which allows us to do an impact study by using a comparative design, which is effectively taking people who are not yet on the programme, using propensity score matching, and then tracking those to see if there's an impact. But I would say we don't just rely on that quantitative analysis. We have a range of other case study research and feedback from workers. To give you a flavour of the impact study, very quickly, this is one of the findings we've got. So what this shows is the proportion of children who take part in the programme who end up in the most severe form of social care, which is where they're removed from their families and placed into care. So it's quite small numbers. So the 2.5% of the comparison group end up in social care after 2 years, compared to 1.7% of the programme group. And the difference there we estimate to be 2,000 children in England per year. So that is also backed up by case study research and some survey research. But that's a flavour of the impact study finding that we can create using the database and a comparison group design. But we have to be careful, because is it only a comparison group? We've done as much controlling as we can. So we do have to be careful about how we interpret it. But nonetheless, that's the kind of results you get. In terms of my reflections, I would say I've got kind of 2 sort of backward-looking ones and 2 forward-looking ones. But my overall reflection is this evaluation has proved really important to the policy-making process. So yesterday, the Chancellor announced a new spending round for England, and the Troubled Families Programme was given another year's funding, and that was part of the explicit announcement. And from internal discussions in Whitehall, the fact that we'd invested in evidence, but we also had impact evaluation evidence, was really crucial and helpful in making the case for the continuation of the programme. So I would say there is this huge world outside of RCTs, but actually in government, it's still not as prevalent as it could be, and Troubled Families is seen as one of the really good examples of trying to take this approach. However, it wasn't an RCT, so I'll come on to that in a minute. So good things, really worth investing in this administrative data collection. It's saved a lot of money. It would have cost millions to do this evaluation through surveys. But it's been a lot of effort on the ground. I think, why not to do an RCT? The primary reason why an RCT wouldn't work for troubled families, it's quite a broad-based intervention. It's all supposed to be about stimulating innovation in delivery. So therefore, it's not what you call a high-fidelity programme where each participant gets the same intervention. So I think that's the sort of primary reason that I feel it would be impractical. But also, I think the randomisation in a devolved context would have been really hard. I mean, we weren't able to do surveys with the comparison group, which give, these families are the most, with the most complex needs, chaotic lives, and actually to get the numbers of those to participate in a control group would have been really hard. And it's also this devolved delivery environment, which is very important for us. So going forward, I would say, linking the point made earlier, that we've got a good understanding, we've got good evidence that this programme as a whole and this amount of money in this public service design is having a positive impact on groups of the population, but we don't yet know enough about what is driving that, which groups are benefiting most, or what's the practice. So we've got work to do still as a sector to develop that and have the evidence. So I think going forward, what we really need is tighter logic models, because I think we need to link the interventions to the outcomes more clearly, and trials, but in specific environments. That's a really good way forward to using RCTs, but I wouldn't want to lose sight of the fact that as government, we're interested in the whole system, and an RCT won't work at a system level, so therefore using and keeping some of these quasi-experimental methods going is important. That's it, thanks.
So it's great to be among a RCT supportive audience here. However, the fact remains that the bulk of public expenditure does not go through evaluation. So in the UK, the proportion of public expenditure that's earmarked to be evaluated is about 13%. And in 2016-2017, an audit of about 100 UK policy reports found that 25% or 25 of them did not mention any kind of evidence when it came to the recommended proposal, the implementation, or the discussion of subsequent impact. So at BIT, I head up the organization's platform for what's called online laboratory experiments, which are another empirical tool that we have to get around some of the bottlenecks with field RCTs that Millie and Kirby already mentioned, and also to make field evaluation, when we do use it, more informative. So I want to spend a little bit of time explaining a bit of what an online lab experiment is, because they've been, economists have been using lab studies since the 60s, but for policymakers and organizations, they're a relatively new tool, and their use case is also slightly different. So there's two main components to an online lab study. The first is the sample, which can be drawn from a generic online panel, or can be targeted, such as NHS nurses or people with low levels of savings. The second component is that these individuals are then brought into what you can think of as a decision simulation. So it's a highly controlled environment where individuals are randomly exposed to different conditions. And in a way, the decision simulation is a bit artificial, but it's a complete blank slate and can be designed as needed for the purposes of this study. So just to give you a bit of a flavor of the kinds of things that we test in the lab, I wanted to go through two examples of work that we've done at BIT. So this was in collaboration with the Money and Pensions Service, where we were interested in how changes to a credit card statement could increase monthly repayments that people were making on debt that they had. So in the simulation, respondents were asked to make a choice about their monthly repayment for a typical income and expense pattern that they had. And one group was shown, let's see if it's working. Yes. One group was asked to do that using a slider, which started at the minimum repayment level. So in this case, in this example, that's 169, and they could move it to a higher repayment level. Another group also saw a slider, but the slider instead reflected the time when the debt would be cleared by. And this was attractive for us to test in the lab because it allowed us to gather quantitative evidence on the impact of these solutions at a very early stage in the design process, and also as a precursor to further development and then testing in the field. A second really attractive feature was that we were able to look at other outcomes that we cared about besides choice. So primarily in this case was whether people actually understood the consequences of making, say, a minimum repayment on their outstanding debt. A second example is work that we've done recently with the Bank of England, where we were interested in testing the effect of different presentations of inflation report summaries to the general public and the extent to which people understood the key messages and also whether it changed the trust towards the bank. So 2 of the interventions that we tested were the business as usual, so fairly technical summary, as well as a summary that aimed to make the contents more relatable to people's daily lives. And the lab is so powerful here because when it comes to central bank communication, we don't really have the luxury to assign people randomly to see different versions in practice. But also, we had complete ownership over the amount of interventions that we tested and also the type of interventions that we put in front of people. And actually, because it's in a sandbox environment, we can actually be a bit more adventurous about the kinds of things that we put in front of people. And finally, speed was also very attractive here. So we were able to collect thousands of observations in the span of just 1 week. So I think the lab is so attractive because of the flexibility that it affords. But I also want to close with just mentioning one of the main drawbacks of this methodology, and that is that there are certain policy problems and interventions that are difficult to fit into a lab environment, mainly because we only have people in the experiment for a fairly short amount of time, so typically sort of 10, 15 minutes. And just a couple of examples of problems that are difficult to fit in that space are things that decisions that are about very high stakes. So buying a house, it's a decision that we sort of come back to many times. We reflect on it extensively. Interventions that are highly personalized, so face-to-face student-teacher interactions, very hard to simulate in an online space. And also interventions that require repeated dosage. So say a family intervention program that's delivered over a period of 10 weeks. So that doesn't mean that the lab is necessarily not useful even for these cases, but it does mean we need to think very carefully about the decision problems that we bring into the lab and also how we do that. Thank you.
Okay. So, before I get into my slides, I'm Alex Sutherland. I'm the Chief Scientist at the Behavioural Insights team. About 2 months into the job, and 2 weeks of that was holiday. So I have not got my head around all of what BIT does. It's quite a lot, as you've seen this morning. Before I talk to my slides, I wanted a quick reflection on my own discipline. So I'm a criminologist by training, just to give you some insight into kind of how that field has developed in terms of running randomised control trials. Criminology has always been a very practical, applied discipline, and have been looking to use trials for quite a long time. We've been doing them long enough. Since about 1935, there was a big gap thereafter, where we can actually talk about the history of kind of RCTs in the field. The first review of that in about 2003 described it as a meagre feast. But in the last few years alone, there's been a huge increase in the use of randomised control trials, and one of the best estimates so far is something like 300 trials in policing alone, and there's about 40 a year being added in policing. And there are also kind of reviews being done by organisations like the Campbell Collaboration that will add to this total. So criminologists have got a lot of information about randomised control trials. We also kind of get to engage in a bit of academic navel-gazing and worrying and hand-wringing to ask ourselves how well do we do or how badly do we do at reporting those trials against standards like the consort statement. Pretty badly, it turns out. And we also get to worry about the impact of RCTs on the field, about how we think about other types of research. In particular, the concern is that RCTs lead to other types of research being ignored or kind of downgraded in some way. So I'll stop talking about criminology and talking about kind of wider public policy research. So I've worked in a few different places, so University of Cambridge, around Europe, and now at BIT. I've got a slightly broader picture on the use of RCTs in social policy. And in short, this design is being used on topics and questions and at a scale that even 5 to 10 years ago, people would have scoffed at if you just told them about it. And I should have said, by the way, most of my research, as Matt mentioned, has been on kind of more kind of complex social interventions. So what I'm saying is coloured a little bit by that. So let's move on to a slide. Okay, so I want to come back to why we use RCTs in the first place. So contrary to what Mr. Blair says. We can use RCTs and other causal designs to answer the question, what would have happened otherwise? Well, not really a but as far as we know, RCTs are the least worst way of determining whether a policy works. Not the best, the least worst. And in many situations, and the caveat is that we know, people have already described, we can't use them in every situation. And if something better comes up, we can use that, great. But it's also important to remember about RCTs that they are not Hulk smash, they're not a blunderbuss. They are much more like a precision tool for answering precise questions. So the quality of the question you ask really matters. If there's a misalignment between the kind of specificity of the question and the design, you're not going to get the kind of results you want to see. I think it's also important to remember that if the situation demands it, we can use something other than an RCT. In my view, the default is always, let's start with a trial, and then if we can't do that, let's see what else we can do. But for example, if you wanted to study the effect of maternal stress on how babies develop, you, I hope, would not be experimentally inducing stress in expectant mothers. But we might be looking at other means to assess the causal impact of this intervention. And for those of you who are wondering, there's a wonderful paper by Florencia Torsha, I think she's at Stanford. She uses earthquakes to understand the impact of maternal stress on in utero development. Short version is, it's bad, but it's an amazing piece of work she did using earthquakes to study this. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking to my slides now and then kind of talk to how to train your dragon very briefly. The success or otherwise, as Millie has alluded to already in RCTs, to me is about three things: planning, preparation, and pragmatism. The key parts of planning, and just as a few things to throw out there: understanding your problem well, knowing what you can affect, what you can or cannot do, asking a precise question, measurement. So too often where trials find no results, people are quick to say, the intervention failed. I find myself asking the question, was it a measurement failure? Were they just measuring the wrong stuff? We also need to keep in mind at all times what business as usual is. This is often forgotten, but again, with null findings, I'm often drawn to thinking, well, what's the comparison being made? And that necessarily means doing more than just an RCT. Just an RCT on its own is a black box in many respects. Preparation covers a wide range of things, but it's really about thinking through the practical steps for the trial from start to finish. That covers everything from pre-registration to protocols, all the way through to kind of how you write up and present your results. Pragmatism: every single trial, not just every trial, every research project faces its own problems. If your planning and preparation are good enough, you can adapt to those problems, and each time you're looking to produce the least worst solution to the problem you're facing. So some quick reflections on the other presentations, if I may. Millie definitely wins the award for highest fidelity to session title by including dragons. But more seriously, so the need for innovation in trials and research is really fundamental. And it isn't just having whizzy new statistics, but it's in things like recruitment into research, retention, and crucially, scale up. Now, Millie highlighted the importance of different information in making decisions about scale-up and informing decision makers. And Janna's presentation on Predictive made me think, maybe that's a platform that would allow us to think about the relative influence of different kinds of information and how they're presented in a safe environment where there isn't £1 billion waiting to be spent on troubled families immediately. It could be, actually, let's think about how we can influence, or what information really influences decisions on scale-up. And on Kirby's presentation, it gives a really good illustration of a rigorous evaluation of a complex social intervention full to the brim with challenges that would be a problem for any research design, but it really illustrates the need for and utility of other kinds of designs, quasi-experimental designs in this case. And I'll finish by saying that in future, the kind of field research, it will definitely include randomized controlled trials until somebody comes along with something better. I'm not holding my breath about that for the time being. But I really am excited about a couple of things that people said. So machine learning, the importance of the possibility of being able to kind of use information which we already have from trials to learn more about what we've got in there and what works best for most people. Also, and to help us think with things like augmented decision making, I'm also excited about how greater computing power is allowing us to do large-scale qualitative research as never before and integrate that with things like trials. Similarly, I think there's much more that could be done around the influence of our social networks. We had some of that from Cass Susteen this morning, and outcomes. So there's a great piece of research, which I'll finish on, by Andy Papachristos at Northwestern. It talks about individual risks of homicide arising from one's network. The implication of that work for policy is that people could eventually be told that their individual risk of homicide was 60% in the next 3 months, say. Not on average, as Millie was talking about, kind of looking at an average, but that individual person's risk of homicide in the next 3 months. Now, that information could be used as an intervention that we could try and test out, but again, how such information is delivered will matter, and as you'll all know, that's where behavioural insights are really powerful. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thanks to all our speakers. There were some fascinating contributions there, and I'm very pleased that you've done your side of the bargain and asked lots of questions on Silo. So I'm going to get straight into them because there are a lot, and we want to get through as many as we can. The first question is really asking about the term gold standard and trying to interrogate that. So the question is, how can we compare the quality of RCTs in a standardised, reliable way?
Funny you should ask that, because at EEF we've had to think about this quite hard because we're commissioning trials that we want to be comparable. And we want to produce useful and reliable results for schools who are our main audience and are not necessarily research literate. So one of the things we've been thinking about is how we can communicate the security of findings. So this is about the amount of bias or statistical uncertainty, inherent in the headline finding. And we've created a scale called a padlock scale, which measures from 0 to 5 padlocks how secure or effectively how good, how gold standard an RCT is. And it combines, it's quite controversial because it combines lots of information on things like threats to validity, so contamination or testing bias, attrition from the primary outcome, etc. So lots of different things. It's a tricky thing to have achieved, and we did that through lots of conversation with evaluators. But yes, that's how we've tackled the question of what is gold standard.
And just before you hand the mic on, how well do you think that's worked?
I think it's got problems, but I think that the kind of idea behind it, which is communicating in an accessible way how good a finding is really important in order to engage practitioners with the results of RCTs.
Do you want to?
Yes, someone. Well, as on the receiving end of having to conform to the standards Millie talks about, I think it's a really important thing that the EEF have done, and actually other people are following suit in the same way. And there are other kinds of reporting standards out there, but the EEF have done a very good job of synthesising the things that we kind of researchers think are the most important. But I think if you're becoming a critical consumer of randomised controlled trials, which I think is part of what we hope people can become, then it's important to engage with these kinds of standards. And they have these immensely boring names sometimes, like risk of bias 2.0 or whatever it might be. But looking around at these things and understanding where the dark secrets might be of a trial, and understanding what the implications of those are for how you consume the results from it are really important. And I do that straight. Every time I see a headline, this or that works, I'm looking at the original trial and going, do I believe it on the basis of what they reported? And there is a kind of another side of this, a movement towards more open science. We're kind of having data and everything out there in the public domain, and that will certainly help. But it's certainly a long way behind being kind of the norm in every way. Yes.
I think it's an important area. When we were publishing findings from troubled families, we were trying to compare them to other social policy evaluations. To answer the question, well, is this good compared to other programs? And you couldn't do that. So it's encouraging to hear efforts to standardise. I think the one potential challenge, one of the challenges here is what you're measuring. So to do that, you require a sort of common outcome measurement. So in criminology, the reducing reoffending rate is the classic. But the danger is that you don't think through the outcomes of the programme. It's all just measured against one ultimate metric because the government happens to collect the data. So I think that's the risk. We have to think about what's the impact of the intervention, not say, oh, we happen to have this good data, let's measure all the interventions against that, when that might be not the right impact to look at.
So the next question, and it's not an anonymous one, so I don't know if that's helped its upvoting or not. It is, do you think it's important to combine qualitative methods with quantitative ones, such as RCTs, to understand why something has or hasn't worked?
Yes.
Do you want to, in the online environment, I was wondering, do you then do that as well? Do you add that into your methodology?
So short answer is I'd like to do more of it, but I also know there's a lot of different approaches to qualitative research, and I already see that. I think there's a question on there about the sampling, so we don't, and in some qualitative research you would just want to get as broad of a range of different sort of views and types of people in, so that's not really something that you would get if you're doing, say, an evaluation in an online lab environment. But I do think qualitative research is just so powerful to unpack sort of some of the motivations that people have for making certain decisions, and I think coming from a sort of more quantitative angle, that's somehow always been we sort of dismiss that, and we don't really take that into account, and I think that's a missed opportunity. So, yeah, but it's not my area of expertise, but I would love to do more of it. Yeah.
From what I remember, but colleagues will be able to correct me more up to date, there's not that much qualitative research with comparison groups, as far as I'm aware. There is obviously a lot of background research, but I think as policymakers, often we don't go back enough to the sort of empirical base research on why problems might be occurring. So I think if you did a behavioural insight studies of policymakers, there's a lot of potential for bias in how we're interpreting results. We all tend to think our programme's the big one, our interventions having the big impact, and actually there needs to be a good counteraction to that. And I think reading qualitative research about, for example, in my case, how families draw on support other than the state, and the impact of that could be much greater on their lives, is really important. So I think it just helps counteract the potential for policymakers to always look for the impact of their programme and a good counterbalance.
Yeah, just a quick one, which is this, that I think that the sort of qual-quant dichotomy is a bit problematic, because actually a really good evaluation would be truly mixed methods, and they need to properly speak to each other, those two parts. And we need more proper mixed method researchers and evaluators out there. One of the things we've struggled with at the EF is that you tend to get people who identify more with either quant or qual, and then actually the reports that you get, those two parts don't speak to each other enough, and that's, I think, something that needs to be fixed or addressed.
I'm just going to paraphrase a famous criminologist, David Farrington, who said on the quant-qual thing, one cannot be done convincingly without the other. And that kind of, to me, is how I view these things, in particular, getting inside the black box of an experiment and understanding. But I was going to ask you that question, Matt, because you're the head of qualitative research at BIT, so what do you think? Just don't say no.
Yes, I think I agree with you and the panel and David Farrington, and who could disagree with David? So here's the next one, and I think, Millie, you'll be particularly on the spot. How do you deal with opposition to RCTs when that opposition is on ethics grounds, and particularly in education?
So I don't think we've actually had that much opposition on ethics grounds, and I think that there's a very good argument to use RCTs, an ethical argument to use RCTs, which is that we have finite resources. And if we don't know whether something works, much worse to go ahead and do it, potentially wasting that money, than to conduct a trial and check whether it works first. So I think as long as you're testing something where we genuinely don't know whether it works, it is perfectly ethical. And we actually haven't had many people argue with that, so that's good.
I was just going to add to that point. So I suppose you have had ethical objections by schools not choosing to be part of the studies. Is maybe perhaps how that goes about.
Yes, we have. I mean, although we have obviously managed to recruit quite a lot of schools, but no, I mean, obviously, ethics are incredibly important, and every single study that we commission has a full ethical, fully ethically reviewed, etc. It's very important that those sorts of things are addressed properly.
Yeah. One observation on that, though, is of all the trials I've done with the EEF, I think I've only ever had one parent contact me directly to ask any questions about what was happening with their child in the school, the experiment I was running, which I was I'm not sure whether I should be cheered by that or depressed, and they're not taking as much interest as I might hope in my study. But I think that there's certainly interest from researchers in this. I think when you do it well, that's what you should expect. You shouldn't expect to have lots and lots of flack from parents, basically. So I took that as a measure of success more than anything else.
So we have had a couple of cases with Predictive where it was actually quite attractive for the organizations that we worked with to actually test things initially in a lab environment. So we're not sort of necessarily putting things into existing systems and processes yet. And that's actually helpful to have that if there is some pushback on ethical grounds. So an example includes say, giving people information or presenting, say, genomic information reports back to people. So when they've given that through some sort of medical portal and giving that information back to them, how do you do that? There's definitely some ethical questions there, and then having that initial stage in the lab can be really helpful to still have that RCT component, and then have a further stage to then decide, how you want to. What next steps you want to take off the back of those results.
Just to add in my own experience here, because having been involved in a number of RCTs in the children's social care setting, we did have some very extensive debates about the ethics of that. And I think what was interesting, was sort of chiming with what you were saying, Alex, is that the biggest ethical concerns were from practitioners. They were very worried about being involved themselves, very worried for the families. We got very little pushback from families and children themselves, and this was including in an RCT of a therapy for sexual abuse survivors, which is obviously requires timeliness and is very insensitive. But the children and families didn't seem to think it was unethical, but there was a lot of concern from practitioners. So it's interesting how sometimes that divide happens. The next question. So in a sense, to do it backwards, the point, I guess, is that even if we're convinced about the importance of RCTs, we can't use an RCT for every change in every part of policy and everything you introduce. So how does one decide when you do this research and design intervention and maybe monitor it, and how do you decide what things need the kind of full RCT treatment? I think that's what it was asking.
Well, I suppose one thing is about, or it's one thing that we think about anyway, is about, so I suppose, yes, if you've got an idea that you want to test, it isn't necessarily going to be ready for an RCT. So, you need to think about how well defined it is. Is there a good sort of logic or theory behind it? Is there any prior evidence is another thing that we look at. So really it's about, the stage of development of a thing, and then obviously designing the evaluation that is appropriate to that stage. And RCTs are only really appropriate when you've got something that's pretty clearly defined, has got some prior evidence, and is scalable. At least that's what we kind of look for.
I want to sort of put you on the spot a little bit, Kirby, as a policymaker. So a number of sort of organisations or parts of government that are crucial, things like, say, child and adolescent mental health, which as a service is intervening. It's meant to be using existing evidence-based interventions, but that doesn't happen all the time at all. So in that, we don't know whether the service as a whole, on average, helps children. There is no solid evidence that can tell us that or not. But obviously it'd be very difficult to RCT that. Where, as a policymaker, where do you think these are the things, as a policymaker, we should just implement because that's our job, and where do you say actually this before we implement it we should do some sort of robust evaluation?
It's a good question. I mean, I agree with Camilla. I always remember one of my favourite quotes about evaluation was, "No intervention should be evaluated until it was proud." And I think they meant experimental evaluation in that case, and too much is evaluated at an early stage. Bit of a cop-out answer, I'm afraid, but I think what struck me being back in civil service is that we're tending to deal with quite high-level decisions. Whereas I think what's been really good about the EEF, and perhaps what needs to happen in child and adolescent mental health and social care and family support services, is you need to create the kind of ecosystem in the delivery chain. And I think it's thinking about who's got responsibility for that. Yes, we have responsibility to create the conditions and sponsor, but I think it's also up to the sectors themselves to kind of really step forward and kind of create an ecosystem. When I was working in health research, I was really struck by every time I met a health survey researcher, they'd say, well, I'm doing the ward rounds at the end of the week. They were sort of active practitioners and researchers. And I think until that culture moves into bigger areas of social policy, and that's what's exciting about what you're doing, I'd like to see a bit more of that and how we create that. I mean, it's not to say, as I said in my talk, that the Treasury in particular is putting a lot, well, you've heard this before, but is particularly keen on evidence-based policy, though they've created a new framework called Public Value Framework, Michael Barber's work, a lot more kind of systematic about what you're trying to do, how do you know when you're getting there, trying to bring a discipline. Spending review document yesterday had a set of outcome metrics that they expect departments to be held to account for. So all of that is the culture the civil service is trying to create, but we are working in a political environment. And I should have said, I think one of the reasons Troubled Families was also difficult to RCT, even if it was a very specified program, there was a lot of pressure to deliver and a lot of pressure to deliver now. So you have to create those conditions. And actually there's a new fund called the Youth Endowment Fund, and to their credit, the Home Office put that at arm's length from the Home Office and said evidence needs to be at the heart of that. So that's another good example. So maybe we just need more of those.
That's a great answer. Janna, I think this one is for your lead. The question is, isn't A/B testing a better alternative to RCT than lab testing? Same advantages, but no lab bias.
Great. So I think if you have a situation where you can actually go to the field and run the exact experiment that you want, then yes, I think in all cases I would say by all means do that A/B test rather than going to the lab. But it's really the cases where actually running an A/B test in practice is either just not possible or very difficult. So for example, in the Bank of England work example that I gave, there just wasn't an option to randomize people to different central bank communications. That just wasn't feasible. So there is no A/B test alternative there. But what we often find is that when you're looking at changing existing systems or processes, you want to have sort of quite good grounds for the intervention that you're testing. Ideally, you have some prior evidence for it, and also you might need to convince some very senior stakeholders to make that change. So the lab is also a way to still run an RCT, but in a way that, again, you can test ideas at an earlier point, maybe be also a bit more daring with the kinds of material that you put in front of people, which I think in many cases is helpful if you're sort of still trying to find out, as a precursor to the field, like what actually do we want to take forward, what's most promising. So it's really about sort of the case in between where actually the A/B test is not quite an option.
I'm going to skip straight on to the next one because I think it's also sort of an adjunct to that. Online testing, what kind of users participate? Is there a selection bias?
So I think in most cases for online testing, you are looking at a convenience sample, so people that have opted in to take part. My view is that in most cases for what you're testing, that doesn't hugely matter. So people have they don't really know when they go into the study what it is about, and that is quite important. There are some studies that find that the targeting is key, though. So instead of, say, if you're looking at, so there's a fascinating paper on that looks at how people in Switzerland vote on the immigration status of individuals, and they have both sort of online lab data on that as well as behavioural actual voting data. And they find that it matters hugely that you actually get voting populations into your online lab study as opposed to, say, just student samples. But in most cases, the actual sort of composition of the sample doesn't, the self-selection aspect doesn't hugely matter. But it's always good to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis.
Great. So I'm going to ask the last question, because I think it's a good last one to finish on. And I'm going to suggest that we want to rerun the poll. So I'm going to open up the poll while the question is running, if we can cope with these two things at the same time. And then we'll look at the poll after the end. So the last question is sort of, I suppose, picking up on this, if an RCT is not a gold standard, it's the least worst. Does that mean that we, or the panelists, would feel comfortable with a before and after comparison as a trial evaluation approach? Alex?
It would really depend on what you were trying to do. If it was a very early stage, like, do we see any kind of movement before and after an intervention? We haven't got a comparison group, and it's very early on in kind of like piloting, development, and so forth. And people do that, it's acceptable. If you're trying to then convince me that you've demonstrated an impact of, say, reducing crime by 90% on the basis of a before and after, I'm never going to believe you. So I think it's a case of choosing where, what approach you're using and when and why, rather than just having a complete blanket. It has to be this or it has to be that. It's a horses for courses type viewpoint, which is a bit of a cop out, I know, but like.
So is this on the specific? Are we reflecting on this question now, or on the before after? Okay. Do you want to speak to that?
Not a technical answer, but I did a lot of longitudinal research at NATSA, and I'd always plug the value of longitudinal complex surveys over time, which don't have a comparison group, but I think have some scope to fill in some of those gaps.
So I would say no to before and after for impact, but we do look at before and after at very early stage in pilot evaluations where we're looking for some evidence of behaviour change, for example, alongside other things like looking for feasibility or scalability, but not for impact, no.
Just going to quickly add to Kirby's point about kind of within unit designs as well. It makes sense to do that. That's fine.
So I suppose another title for the talk could have been, do we want to train our dragon? Which is perhaps no. But we can now hopefully see the results of the poll, and
Does that mean we've done well?
I don't know. I think we've talked earlier about echo chambers and being reinforced with your view that you came in with. I'm not sure we can put up the comparison of the first poll, but I suspect it was going to look very similar. Well, I think the feeding poll did the same thing, but it's proving it's live. Oh, no, there we are.
Yeah, it depends.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to read it. Yes. Oh, so I think that's probably a success. I think we've provided greater context. More nuance, exactly. Although I probably was going to say that whatever the result of the poll, that we were sixth. Anyway, I must thank our speakers. It was fascinating and great questions, and it was a great session. So thank you very much, and thank you for speaking.